Hello, everyone. It really is so wonderful to see all of you, all the familiar faces and some of the new ones. Thank you so much for being here to honor John. The girls and I are deeply grateful to be part of this moment. It's been about 6 months since he's been gone, and we're still trying to wrap our heads around that. First, a special thank you to the committee who helped put this all together: Carol Scheidler, Greg Silver, Marcia Goldstein, Rabbi Critchever, and of course the entire staff. Your work means more than you know. Okay, let me briefly catch you up on where we've been and what we've been up to since 1994. Our daughters Rachel and Jessica are here tonight. Rachel lives in Rochester, New York with her family, and she works with PBS Kids Ready to Learn initiative. Jessica lives in San Francisco with her family, and she develops wellness centers in high schools in Marin County and elsewhere. And I am exceedingly proud of them and all of our 4 grandchildren. After John and I left Indianapolis, we spent the next 7 years in San Diego. John was the senior rabbi at Beth Israel, where I taught in their day school, and I helped run the religious school for a while too. I also went to UCSD to become an educational therapist. John made a lot of innovations at Beth Israel, and he helped them raise the funds to build their new campus in La Jolla. But it was not a perfect fit for him. So John went to New York in 2001 to Temple Shari Tefillah, where he stayed until retirement. I worked in the Learning Center at the Ramaz School in New York City, and I spent some time doing cognitive and academic testing on homeless adults. We ultimately retired back to San Diego, which is a very nice place to be, I have to admit. Since John left IHC, among other things, he was the president of the United Way of San Diego. He was the editor of the CCAR Journal. He then became president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He also taught a practical rabbinics class at HUC in New York, and he mentored many young rabbis over the years. You trained up a good rabbi. Now, a little history of our 20 years here at IHC. Jerry, I remember it a little bit differently. So here at IHC, a place that still feels like home, it really actually all started at camp, and we met you at camp too, Jerry. John was a student at HUC in Cincinnati. He was the OFTI advisor. He was the Gucci assistant rabbi, although the assistant director, it wasn't Gucci back then, it was UCI. Goldman hadn't given the money yet. IHC often helped the camp a lot with equipment and supplies in those days, and that's how we came to know and admire Rabbi Murray Saltzman. He was desperately needing an assistant rabbi. Murray asked John to become his student intern here during John's last year at HUC. And since John had finished his coursework and only had to write his thesis, it seemed like a perfect opportunity. So after that year, he became the full-time assistant rabbi. Now, the 70s marked the beginning of the end of the classical Reform era. Now, the German Jews were kind of in charge up until that point, and they had a very particular way of approaching Reform Judaism. Services were different back then. Cantor Steve Richards was our music director because the word cantor was too orthodox. Steve stayed in the choir loft in the back. He did not come onto the bema. The rabbis, including John and Rabbi Saltzman, wore black robes, emulating the clergy at Second Pres up the street. There was no talit, there was no yarmulke, that was too Jewish. And my memory is that one of John's early sermons as an assistant proposed wearing a talit and doing away with the robe. You would have thought that he wanted to tear down the ark. Town hall meetings followed with a lot of hysteria. I remember 3 of them. IHC was becoming too Orthodox. IHC was becoming too Jewish. And eventually, the board ruled that the senior rabbi would choose the bima attire. Somehow, everyone survived. The robes went away. The talit appeared, and eventually the kippah appeared. And I remember the story about the Ethiopian boy who said to John that he didn't look like a rabbi because he didn't have a kippah. It was a different era. Esther Saltzman was the first rabbi's wife at IHC who ever worked at a job other than being the Rebbitzin. She held her own job separate from that. She set a great precedent for me. People came to temple dressed in their finest, often wearing a hat for the holidays. And then there was the electric button on the bima floor. Do you remember that? The rabbi would walk over it very subtly, and when he would step on that electric button, the bima doors would open. It wasn't doors, it was a curtain that would open. This was magic to the kids. And every once in a while, we would find one of the kids standing in front of the ark going, Shema, Baruch, trying to find just the right magic word to make that ark open. Today, we're back to the tradition of giving congregants the honor of opening the ark. Those early years were incredibly social. There were daily bridge games held in the old library every single day. Cigarette smoke was so thick that you could barely see the cards. John, Murray, Muriel Romer, Pearl Jaffe, Marge Gordon, Pat Neal, they all played. Harvey Gaddy, our superintendent, lived in the building with his dog Thor. He, as you mentioned before, he could do anything, play piano, cater dinners with Willa, arrange flowers. He could even tear the phone books in half. Do you remember that? He did that to impress the kids. I do have this other story. We were here to be welcomed officially on staff, and I was wearing a fancy outfit, and we were here early, and I wanted to do something. I didn't have anything to do, and I wandered into the library where we had these little board dinners, and Harvey was putting out the greens and the flowers on the table in a way that was looking nice, and I said, Harvey, can I do something to help? And he said, well, you could lay out the greens. So I take the greens, and I'm putting them on the table, and I said, is that okay? And he looked me straight in the eye and said, no. And so he said, let me show you how to do this. And he showed me how to put out the greens. And then he said, okay, I'm going to show you how to put out the flowers, but listen to me first. He just knew everything. He was quite a guy. Anyway, 4 years into our time here, Rabbi Saltzman, as Jerry said, left to become the senior rabbi at Baltimore Hebrew Congregation. And John had to become the associate rabbi at the time, but was not eligible. And you had to have 10 years of experience to be eligible for a large congregation like IHC, but there was a loophole. If the temple interviewed other candidates in good faith for a year and still wanted John, they could hire him. And that year, we watched all kinds of men interview, and we thought more than once that someone else would have that job. And by the way, the Reform Rabbinate was strictly a men's club at that time. Well, the last candidate came in twice, and we thought he had that job for sure, but he blew it. And so how did he blow it? He made a little comment about some of the hallways looking a little shabby. Uh-oh. It's not a nice thing to say. So John was hired shortly thereafter. And IHC took a chance on a kid who was just turning 30. So what did John bring to IHC? Here are some of the things that I remember, and some of you do too. A lot of renovations over the years, the hallways, and a lot more, and the place really did need it. He brought a lot of youth programming, the Rosh Hashanah retreat at the camp, which continues today, I'm happy to hear. He brought Janice Roger to IHC, lots more creative religious school offerings, and a confirmation exam, and I bet that's gone. He brought the 9th grade human sexuality retreat, which some of us taught, and I think some of you attended. He brought speed Hebrew learning weekends, the Block Speakers Forum, outdoor chapel services. Remember the outdoor chapel? It was very filled with mosquitoes, as I recall. Remember we had a sukkah tour? We went from house to house with people who had a sukkah in the backyard. John used to walk through the building with Muriel Romer and then Elaine Arfa. They were both so wonderful. Once a month, they would walk around this property inside and out just to check the property. And that was a habit left over from his days as facilities director at Gucci, and also from his first job at a temple. John's very, very first job at a synagogue was in Pittsburgh at Temple Sinai. John was their summer janitor. John was a guy who could buff floors and clean toilets, and he cared about the way things looked. He went to Wharton, so he knew about finances. He knew about a budget. And the board was not always thrilled about a rabbi being involved in finances. But John did that. Other changes John brought. When he arrived at IHC, French was taught in our preschool. But when he became senior rabbi, French was switched for Hebrew. And as I recall, the nursery school director resigned. I want to say that he started Torah study, but maybe it was the minyan. Toward the end of his tenure, he welcomed a female shofar blower on the bima, and that was quite a moment when Patty started, wasn't it? I think people stood up and clapped. Those 20 years were part of a great era for Temple. Being on the board or Temple president was an honor, more prestigious than leading almost any other Jewish organization, maybe even Broadmoor. Temple was the social heart of the community. Families scrambled to book their events at Temple. Parents of brides would sometimes negotiate with the parents of the bar mitzvah families who shared the same date, and maybe they would buy the bima flowers if they could have the social hall for the evening. That social hall was the place to entertain. And in those days, we sent out a weekly, or I don't know, maybe it was a monthly bulletin, printed and mailed to every family in the congregation, and it included everything, including the sermon title. John had to pick a topic and stick with it. This was awful. Congregants expected a full 3-point sermon every single week, and they readily shared their reviews. During our 20 years, we led quite a few trips to Israel, and John took a couple trips to Russia to visit refuseniks. We also led about 20 confirmation trips to New York without ever having the sense to hire nighttime chaperones. Apparently, you guys have gotten smarter since then. We never lost a kid except for Lisa Shockett. Somehow she got left behind in Tower Records. We did find her. A student did throw a hamburger out a hotel window once and did hit a cop. But most of the time it went very smoothly. John insisted that the kids dress up and would not let them wear sneakers. I disagreed on that one, but he believed that if they dressed nicely, they would behave nicely, and usually they did. One winter, I remember John hurt his back dropping off our preschool carpool. As he fell into the snow downstairs, a preschooler yelled, "Rabbis are dropping." Another back crisis was the day of Kol Nidre. John could not get off our bedroom floor. Neil Levine came over to the house. He gave John a shot, gave him a brace, and told me what kind of shoes John would need. We dashed over to Goodman's Shoes, and John remained upright for all of Yom Kippur. This is like a miracle. After another back crisis, John was in traction. Remember traction? After we got home from the hospital, Jerry Stein brought over in his car, I think he took us home from the hospital too, because it was a smoother ride in his car. Jerry loaned us our first remote control television. Wow, that was quite a thrill. John spent a lot of time visiting people in the hospital. That was a big, big part of his rabbinate. It's not so much anymore. Back then, HIPAA did not exist, and Pat Neal got the weekly lists of Jewish patients. John visited not just IHC members, but anyone who was Jewish, and so did all the rabbis in town. And the worst thing you could hear from a congregant in the hospital? Rabbi Sasso has already been here. There were so many great memories from those years. John was on a Sunday morning TV show with a priest and a Protestant minister. For a while, it was Bill Hudnut. And then Michael Kinnaman, who had been running the Disciples of Christ seminary here. And coincidentally, Michael now lives in San Diego, and he and John had renewed their friendship in the past couple of years. Now, if you remember, that show was called Focus on Faith. Jessica, when she was little, always called it Focus on Fake. Being the rabbi's daughter was not always easy. Expectations were high. Teachers occasionally said things like, "Well, Rachel, your dad's the rabbi, you tell us the answer." Once we were grocery shopping at Marsh, when two separate people said to 5-year-old Jessica, "Hey, your dad married me." And she shot back, "He did not, he married my mommy." We made a good life here. Indianapolis was a wonderful place to raise our children. They had excellent schools, the Hebrew Academy, West Lane, North Central. The kids were in IFTY, OFTY, Debets, Dolls. We lived in a very sweet little house with a $350 mortgage. Some of our babysitters and kids who mowed the lawn are now leaders of this congregation. One of them, Sonia Cantor, is a past president of IHC. We made wonderful friends, and John had very dear personal relationships with the leaders and the staff of IHC. Many of them are no longer with us, and we miss them dearly. Of course, I need a Kleenex. Okay, my nose is running. Of course, it wasn't all a bed of roses. John made mistakes, some that haunted him. He once said the wrong name at a funeral. Another time, he asked a widow, "How's your husband feeling?" And she replied, "You should know you buried him." There were political disagreements. There were tensions over sermons, salaries, decisions. People aren't perfect. They are just human, and rabbis are just human. It turns out that life is not about perfection. It's about goodness and striving toward it. We found such a good life here, and we found good friends. You know who you are. John found racquetball at the JCC, and he sat in the Schwitz weekly with Ira Jaffe of blessed memory and many others. One of his favorites was an older guy named Sarge. I don't recall his last name, maybe Rob Rifkin would remember. But Sarge once said something in Yiddish that was so profound that John repeated it to every confirmation class after that. Sarge was actually quoting his beloved mother. And I'll leave you tonight with John's confirmation class charge that originated in the Schwitz at the J. Sarge's mom said that there are only 3 important things for us to remember: Zaya Yid, Zaya Mensch, Zai Stark. Be a Jew, be a good person, and be strong. Shabbat shalom and be well.